Thank you for your involvement and stay and listen. I forgot to confirm the declaration of members' interest. I'll move item 4. Can I have a seconder, please? Councillor Steadman. Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, Councillor Staines.
I am a shareholder in my freedom, and therefore I will be sitting back in item 7.
Thank you. Thank you. That's noted. Those in favour, please say aye. Against, no. And while we have the Chief Executive present, I'm asking for your indulgence for Dr. Bidrose to give us a quick update on the water situation for people's information and wider information.
So I think you were all there during the earlier briefing, so you know the cause of the missing pipe work in our documentation and so on. Just letting you know where things are at the moment. So the pipe work is now completely flushed. So that is that slug of untreated water that came down from Ross Creek has now been flushed out of the main pipes. We are asking people throughout that CBD, sort of lower city rise, Stafford Street, Harbour Side, and then through the student flats area. We were asking people to run their own taps for 10 to 15 minutes just for anything that went up people's own side laterals to clear out their own pipes. Our testing, we're testing 14 different locations around, and our testing shows that throughout this untreated water being in our pipe work, there was also water from Mount Grand in the pipe work, so it was actually a mix because the pressure from the other town supply was coming through at the same time. So it does look as if there was some level of chlorine loading throughout that episode, so we are hoping that that's useful, but we are advised that to meet water standards we need 3 days of clear results for the water coming out of taps in town, and that people need to boil their water for that 3 days and 24 hours afterwards. So throughout the day, the economic development team have been ringing businesses right through town to make sure people know. The environmental health team and the CSA staff have been ringing particularly food and places that are involved in the preparation of food, cafes and so on. We are just at the moment printing a leaflet to go in a leaflet drop to 1,700 houses and about 800 businesses that could potentially have taken untreated water, to make sure people know that that boil water notice remains in place for at least 4 days. So 24 hours after we have our 3rd day of clear tests. The hospital have their civil defence bunker up and running and are aware of the potential for illness. We won't get back our first day of testing until tomorrow, so we have no idea how at risk this slug of water was, and we also will never know just how much was in any person's individual tap if somebody showered in it, for example. What we think, most people who poured a glass of this water, it will have been very obvious that they shouldn't drink it. It was very discoloured. So some people will have drunk clean water this morning, will probably be fine because it was probably city water, but even though people are now running clear water, the boil water notice remains in place.
Thank you for that. Can I start? I guess there'll be a few questions. Are you confident, and you appear to be from those comments, that it is contained to a fairly discrete central area?
Yes, we're absolutely, we are able to exactly track where the water went. We're able to track just how far down past the octagon that water started to turn up. And as we emptied the hydrants, we were able to tell as we drained which bits of pipe got water. So sort of Woodhaw, Leith Valley, the CBD, as far, we've been slightly risk averse, if you like, in our maps. So we've gone a little bit further out than we would suggest, about halfway up Stafford Street.
I'm just asking to ensure that people in areas that are
outside of that, they can be completely confident.
Caught with a 3-day
absolutely.
Boil. Okay.
And we've got we have delivered water tankers to the 2 schools in the area, which is George Street Normal and Logan Park, and also to the hospital, university, We'll be making water tankers available in and around town as well, which will be available until later this evening. Then tonight they'll go home and refill, and they'll be available again during the day or over the time that boil water notice is in process. So Ruth is just arranging those now.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Questions anywhere? Councillor O'Malley.
I've just got the DCC webpage up. I can see the boil water notice. Is there any way to make it bigger? I mean, it's just a little notice there on the...
Make it bigger on the website. I don't.
Yeah, it's not the
can
dominant. It's not the first thing you see when you get in.
Yeah. Can you flick a note through to Sarah? If you send it to Sarah on PIM and say make it the whole of the front page of the DCC website, we'll get that done straight away. Good idea.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
A secondary issue, and probably not a preeminence today, but a lot of these businesses with a presumably rateable water supply, who will be then being encouraged to flush out a lot of water that they'll be paying for. Will there be some looking at some stage?
This is down the track. The first, the most urgent thing, well, for householders too, is for people, if they've filled up a bottle of water and popped it in the fridge this morning, they need to throw it away. If they've washed a lettuce this morning and then popped it in the fridge, it would be wise to throw that away. So for people to err on the side of caution, that's the first thing. We are worried about food preparing premises who may well have washed lettuces and put them in their salad and things like that. So businesses there will be some losses, and we're encouraging businesses to contact their own insurance companies in the first instance. I dare say we will have some businesses approach us about potential water loss, and we'll have to consider that when it happens.
All right, thank you very much. That's very helpful. Okay, can we now go to the agenda, the Part A reports? First of all, item 7, warehouse precinct update. Doctors Johnson and Phillip, welcome. I'm assuming you want to make some introductory comments, and I think it would be helpful if you talked about the process that you detail in the report that's got you to this point, and where the consultation will proceed and discussions will proceed henceforth, and how, well, I'll leave it entirely to you, but clearly we've got a lot of interested parties, and I think in terms of the wider subsequent developments elsewhere in the city with these sorts of spaces, however they're configured, we want to make sure that as many people as possible are happy. Good luck with that. This is going to be a challenge for all of us, I think. So the floor is yours.
Thank you for having us and for considering this report, which is essentially an update on stage 3 and 4 of the warehouse precinct upgrades, as well as you mentioned, the community engagement to date. So I'll just run through that first. As you know, there's been quite a bit of engagement on the warehouse precinct before my arrival during the past years, and that the revitalisation plan was approved in 2013 to go ahead and work toward detailed design and implementation phases. Since then, there have been a number of updates and workshops held. Most recently, we had 2 workshop evenings in the warehouse precinct on March 21st and 22nd of this year. One of the big outcomes from those workshops was that the community and stakeholders emphasized the need for improvements to the streetscape that were more than surface level, that were meaningful, and that encouraged a variety of users to come to the area for meaningful reasons. And that essentially was what sparked our design development of the shared space proposal on Bond and Water Streets, was to try and create a different kind of space that had quite a bit of meaning embedded in it. So I'll touch on that a little bit in a second, but just to finish off, we did provide that concept out to the wider community to get feedback, and largely the feedback we got was very supportive, actually reflecting very much the comments that Generation Zero put forward, which is that the concept itself is fantastic, that the site has potential, although of course there are concerns about being cold and windy, but that's pretty much for every site in Dunedin. And then there's mixed opinions on car parks. So essentially what we're proposing to do in this report moving forward is that the concept is approved, more or less, but that the final design development of it, the last sort of stages of tweaking, are subject to consultation with the Disabilities Issues Advisory Group, which I'm meeting with this Friday. And I've already had some preliminary conversations with, as well as wider consultation on the parking plan itself. So going out to the community, as we have with other parts of the warehouse precinct, to determine the parking needs and how we might be able to push and pull for the better of the area in general. So just to touch a little bit on the Bond and Water Street proposal, since it's been a subject of conversation, the idea is that it's very much a transition sort of design, that it is a shared space, but a shared space that has a chance of sort of getting through, I suppose, if you will. That I know in the past there's been some hesitancy to even propose shared space because of a preconception that parking would not be allowed within a shared space environment. And so one of the ideas here was to show that we could create a shared space environment and allow for some parking. The reason that we've gained 14 car parks in the current iteration of the plan is not because we were trying to squeeze in as many as possible, and there was a bit of media coverage that wasn't quite bent in the direction that I would have bent it if I were writing it. So the car parks were gained essentially because there is an unused bus stop that we don't really have control over, that won't be needed anymore, so there's quite a bit of room there. And the fact that we're looking at narrowing in the curbs in order to slow traffic. So that creates an extra amount of space to be able to angle car parks rather than put in parallel parks. But I take the comments and I'm very happy to consider different parking configurations as we move forward in the design development. The other thing to note is that what we are proposing with the car parks by using alternating grass pavers and a certain weaving pattern was the idea that the space could be quite flexible. So as was mentioned, the space could be used for different purposes at different times of the day or perhaps on the weekends. There are certainly different things we could try, introducing movable or more permanent types of street furniture or retractable bollards or different kinds of things to encourage those different uses. So that comes down to kind of the finishing details of the space, if it were. The other aspect to note is the curb detailing and whether or not a curb should exist in a shared space. And I do have quite a bit of experience and international expertise on urban design and shared space scenarios, and they can exist successfully both ways. There's been mixed opinions as to whether it's better or worse for the visually impaired community to have a curb there. So that's advice I'll be seeking from that community this Friday, and happy to sort of work in whatever direction works best for them with that. But also to note is that in our current funding that we have available, the space, in order to achieve the effect that we've drawn, we don't have enough funding to be paving over that entire space and sort of leveling out all of the levels to be the same level. So that's one of the reasons that in our report we're recommending that a further budget be considered in the long-term plan, is to essentially allow us a little bit of room to really do this right as a real trial for Dunedin. And in the first instance, the proposal is to do the concept with the resin surfaces the same way that we created the 3D pedestrian crossings on Clyde Street. And that if the community reception is strong toward that and the monitoring is positive that we do after that's implemented, that we could look at replacing that resin with more permanent pavers should that funding be released. So that's one consideration as a step toward what this design could become and the kind of constraints that we're trying to work within in order to propose something that's bold and yet obviously works within what we have available to us. Trying to find a balance, if you will.
Thank you. You don't want to make any comment on Johnson, you were happy in the meantime?
We'll give you the difficult question. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So to be clear, we're being asked to approve the design for this work that then goes out and gets tweaked maybe after it's talked. So this council don't have final sign-off on what the design is.
That could be an option, if you like. More or less, it's about approving the concept of a shared space in the way that it's been put forward with the sort of weaving pattern and the kind of materials that we've proposed and the kind of plantings that we've proposed. But very happy to present the final tweaked version for approval as well, if that's considered
Well,
necessary.
With that in mind, in due course, I'll move the recommendations, but I'll add with the final design to be presented to council for final sign-off.
Yeah, thank you.
You'll need.
Yeah,
You've got another question?
yeah, I do. So in terms of, and then the second part of that, around hinting at what we might want to do in the long-term plan and where we might want to allocate those funds. So is that for this project? So I'm confused because it says this will be done in this financial year and the long-term plan kicks off in 18-19.
Yeah, sorry for any confusion. So what's being proposed here is fully fundable with the current budget. But what I'm proposing within the report is that there's an extra layer that could be achieved if additional funding were released in another budget year. So that could include additional curb build-outs, additional plantings, additional crossing points, additional better materials, so an upgrade of materials from resin surfaces to more permanent, more durable paving surfaces. So that's what it is that it's a design that's achievable within the current budget, but recognizing that the current budget is limited for the land area that's being considered, and that additional budget in a subsequent year could benefit the area and improve the current concept.
I want to go back to, I mean, you talk about more crossing points, and that's, I guess, relevant to the discussion we had in public forum as to what the function of a shared space is. And in my head, a shared space is one where I can cross wherever I like as a pedestrian and walk down the middle of the street if I like. And do you accept that by putting in crossing points, you're sending a fairly clear signal to pedestrians that that is where they belong, regardless of how many of them there are in the area?
Yeah, it's a good point, and we can look at that detail. Absolutely. The trick of it is that the crossing points are at the edges of the shared space where there are quite busy roads. So it seems that there's possibly people who are using the side roads who may want to cross and want a clear signal that they can cross safely. I know, speaking from experience, walking up and down Rattray Street, I don't necessarily feel safe at the moment crossing over Bond or Vogel for that matter. So I think an additional cue that it's a safe crossing where pedestrians have priority may not hurt in those locations. But perhaps internal at the corner of John Wycliffe where you have Bond and Water Street meeting, perhaps there's more flexibility in that arrangement there that could sort of loosen up that fabric. But just to be clear, we're looking at the whole plan that has been put forward as an attachment to this report. So it's not just the shared space that I'm talking about that could benefit from the extra crossing points. It's, for example, looking at additional crossing points across Jetty Street where people are coming off of the overbridge, and there's quite a few people that cross there that put their lives in danger at the moment. So we're proposing one crossing point, but it could probably benefit from another one, or looking at curb build-outs further down along Bond Street as well.
Thank you. I have two more questions. One is around your comments. You say that evidence says it can work or either way with curb or not, regardless of the accessibility component that you're investigating. But these things don't exist in a vacuum, right? So it's that plus all the other things that are in that urban design setting that make that work. So do we know which of in the areas where it works with a curb, what the other mitigating factors are that contribute to it working there?
Well, like you said, it really depends on the configuration and what are the different bits and pieces that are going on and what's neighboring and that sort of thing. But I mean, I suppose it's about creating a seamless environment for the pedestrian so that they do feel free to move about, but having some of these visual cues for the motorists as well. I suppose in Dunedin there's a certain driving culture that is aggressive, and I'm, to be honest, a bit reluctant to not have any curbs at all in this shared space environment in Dunedin because of the driving culture here that is different and more aggressive than what I've seen in other places, even in the States. And so I think that there probably does need to be a side area where people are assured that no cars will be driving. And I know that's a cue I've gotten from some visually impaired people, that they do want to have reassurance that there's a space where there won't be a vehicle. So that's part of the reason for considering that. But what might be a nice stepping stone is if we were to implement this as it is with the resin surfaces and the curbs, and if the feedback was that the curbs were unnecessary or actually hindering the design that we, and if the council did approve further funding for the area, then we look at making that all one level when we replace the resin surfaces with paving.
So on a philosophical, well, it's not a philosophy, but so you wouldn't be comfortable recommending any streets having no curb in the city centre, given our driving culture? Anywhere in the wider central city plan work, this will flow through, presumably.
No, I'm not saying that completely. I'm just hesitant, and I would want reassurances that that there's some larger uptake of a slow speed environment and of pedestrian priority, and that that has to go outside of urban design's control as well. For example, in parts of the States, there are places where pedestrians have legal right-of-way everywhere, not just in pedestrian crossings, and that can make a huge difference in terms of behaviors. So I would very much like to see that happen, to see that that disappear, but in its current state where New Zealand is at and where Dunedin's at, I'm a bit hesitant to recommend that as a safe option.
And just finally, because it was mentioned in this report, and the wonders of social media reminded me that it was 3 years to the day this week that we had our own Vision Princess Street workshops, which predate your time on staff. But I have been asked what's happening with that work in the 3 years since by people who were also of the 60 in attendance. So can we get an idea of where that work is going?
Yeah, of course. So that work will be looked at as part of the wider Central City Plan works. So it's not within what's funded in the warehouse precinct. But I would say that that feedback that's been gathered from a lot of those workshops has fed into a lot of our design thinking on the sidelines as well. So there are certain themes that keep arising from community members across the Central City, and we've listened to those themes, and we're trying to find a balance.
Thank you. Councillor Gary.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for the report. I was really excited by it, and I just wanted to clarify that I understood that you've taken best practice, you've taken your extensive experience previously, and you've put the local context on it to inform the design. Would that be an accurate description?
Yes.
Yeah. So would you have any other comments around transitioning from a car-dominated city in a particular space to a shared space or a pedestrian space? Because it is quite I mean, you talked about this being part of the transition, and you'll have heard me ask that question of the two presenters before. This could be viewed. Is it quite a task to take people through that transitioning?
It is, and it's complex. It's not, I would say it's not confined to one discipline alone by any means. So it has to do with, having a reason for people to walk around, having a nice environment for people to walk around, having viable alternatives, so cycle paths, which we're working on, and an efficient, affordable, frequent public transport system, which is really important. And I guess it's about showing people the alternative and the benefit of the alternative to driving in a car. So it's not about demonizing the car, but it's about displaying the alternatives in as an enticing way as possible and highlighting the health benefits around getting out of your car and experiencing the world in other ways. So I think this is a stepping stone, but other important components involve encouraging of people to live centrally so that they can walk around. If people are always going to be driving in and looking for places to park, then that's always going to be a constraint. But if you have ways in which people can get to the center of the city, or ways in which people are already living in the center of the city that help to alleviate that pressure a bit, then that frees up the pressures on parking and vehicular transport. So just to highlight, I'm not suggesting any solution, just to highlight the complexity of it all. But I do think this would be a good stepping stone, just to show what a certain alternative is, and perfectly happy to push the design a bit further to emphasize the sunny side of the street and perhaps take out some of those parking spots, or look at parallel versus instead of angled parking. So that it is a successful example of a different kind of street that can exist in this city.
So it's the whole package that we need, and this is one element of it.
Exactly.
My second question was around the stakeholder groups, and I just wondered, were the previous presenters, were they participating, engaging in that process? Have they engaged in that process?
They submitted the same submission that you saw here a week after the deadline.
Okay.
So I have considered it, but I haven't had a chance to talk to them yet. I'm happy to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Lofisa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your ongoing mahi and commitment to this vision. My two questions refer to page 37, the Māori impact statement. And can you just clarify, please, the Runaka and whānau concerns about possible reverse sensitivity? What does that mean, please? Sensitivity issues.
My take on it, and I can follow up with them to get a little bit more clarity, but it seemed to me that the concern was to do with the wider warehouse precinct and the changing of uses, and actually a lot of it having to do with increased pressure on parking and people not having enough parking.
Okay.
So that's what it seemed to be to me, but I'm happy to clarify that with them.
Okay, and the second question relates to the second point under that Māori impact statement heading. So they want DCC to note the significance of that waihi tupuna site. So what mechanisms are we employing to continually note that significance?
Right. So one of the goals with this design was as a kind of stepping stone not only into the shared space territory, but also as a stepping stone into encouraging a sort of placemaking that helps to tell different stories about the place and the people of the place. We have a very short timeline in which to pull it off, so it was kind of a first step in which we took a concept forward and didn't necessarily have everyone involved from the very seed of the design as we would like to in the future. However, what we're doing moving forward is looking to engage KTKO to develop with the local Runaka a cultural narrative that, and to my understanding, there is a draft of this that exists that I've only recently become aware of, but I've expressed a lot of support for continuing this draft and revisiting it and using it as a way to inform our designs, and would like to meet with everyone early on. So I would say that this is a sort of, I guess, goodwill gesture toward what could happen in the exchange area and other parts of the central city moving forward, and that's very much at the forefront of the agenda in coming months and years.
Thank you. Councillor Wiley.
I'll check with Councillor Vandervis if he's got any questions first. Lee, are you there?
Yes, I do have one question, if now's a good time.
It is.
Great. Dr. Phillips, congratulations on what I see as a well-designed and attractive concept. Lovely drawings, like it all. On page 49, there is a lovely drawing showing warm brown yellow pavers, but otherwise there's quite cold grey pavers shown. I'm wondering, would it be possible for the warm brown or yellow pavers to be used as opposed to the very concrete-looking cold grey pavers, which might be just a little bit cheaper?
Well, I will say that the pavers haven't been chosen necessarily because they're cheaper. And to a certain extent, I am inheriting a palette that is already underway within the precinct. So there's, and we're introducing quite a sort of bold, different pattern on Bond and Water Street that I'd like to make sure there's some connection with what exists on the other side of Crawford Street so that it does seem to work together as a whole warehouse precinct. So I'm a little bit hesitant to introduce a completely new palette at this point just for that reason alone. But I take your point and I agree it's an important concern. And I think that we really need to consider a variation of colours in the Central City Plan palette moving forward.
Okay.
Do you agree, Dr. Phillip, that the colour of the pavers in the Octagon, for instance, which is a yellowish brown, is a desirable warm kind of colour? And would there be some consistency in having some similar types of colours in your new, lovely, attractive design concept?
I do think the colour's beautiful. There are concerns with the tactility of the pavers and how slippery they become. One of the reasons that we were proposing this sort of red colour within our shared space environment was as a kind of, if you say, integration between the warehouse precinct and the wider central city. So I know that there has been some concern in the past that the warehouse precinct sits isolated from the rest of the central city, and I want to try to encourage a breakdown of that conception because it's very much meant to be part of the central city proper. And so, if you will, there's a certain mixing of palettes going on in the Bond and Water Street environment that does have a sort of hat tip toward the old red pavers. However, as noted earlier, the red color will be done in resin to begin with unless there's further funding approved. So a red paver could be considered if that further funding becomes available.
All right, Councillor.
Thank you.
Councillor Wiley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Phillip, I'm actually sort of taken back by Councillor Vandervis not raising any issues about car parking. But anyway,
Please don't provoke him. Right.
Unfortunately, all three of my questions are related to car parking.
Oh, good.
The car park at Crawford, Water and Vogel Street, does DCC have any plans to take that from just a single level to make it a multi-level or anything like that to work in with the space? And
Oh, were you talking about the car park that exists currently?
yeah.
We don't have any plans at the moment, but it's certainly something we could consider in the future.
Okay. Has there been any discussion with the Distinction Hotel in finding out what capacity or where they are at with their occupancy during the day? Are they half full during the day? Are they full with corporate clients?
We have discussed this with them in the past year or so. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we do have the numbers somewhere, and it's a number we'll include on our parking plan that we put out to the community for consultation on the parking in the area. My understanding is that that car park is under quite a bit of pressure, and there's a waiting list to get on as a permanent as a permanent tenant of that car park. I'm not sure what their capacity numbers are for everyday parking, but I can find that out.
Okay. The other thing that I sort of, as I was going through the imagery and the plans, is, and this may be outside your scope a little bit, as a gig city, are we looking at using any technology to improve car park accessibility, whether it's sensors or something like that, to monitor what's vacant, what's in use? So actually, even though we may be removing some car parks, we're actually getting more effective use out of the ones we do have or will have.
I think that's a really important point, and you're right, it's a bit out of my realm, but I do know that Transport is looking at this very seriously and coming up with a comprehensive parking plan and comprehensive modern monitoring technologies around that plan is an important part of the Central City Plan work that's going on at the moment. So I do know that is underway in the background of things, but I don't know exactly where that's at. So.
Okay. And in your opening, or actually I think it was in response to Councillor O'Malley, I think it might have been, or somewhere along the line, you defined, or can you define the term you used, the driver culture in Dunedin is aggressive?
Did I say aggressive? Well, my experience is that of crossing the street, actually, where we have the 3D pedestrian crossings at the moment, and being seen clearly by two drivers and having them slam on the gas to try and run me over, and subsequently I blew out my knee and was injured for a couple of years after that. So that's my experience of the aggressive driving culture in town. I'm sure other stories are there as well. But I have noticed quite a bit of reluctance for of vehicular behaviors to yield to pedestrian movement, and I think it's extremely unfortunate, especially in some of our main spaces.
Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
Can I just add to the answer around the car parking? The other action that's been taken in the area with regards to the parking rules under the district plan was to change the rules such that spare car parks could be leased as of right. So under the current district plan, you need to get a resource consent to lease car parks, and under the new, because our initial investigations in the area several years ago showed quite a bit of vacancy in private car parking. So where car parking isn't required for an activity, so for example, the retail shops across the one-way system along the railway land have very low occupancy of their car parks. At the moment, you'd need to get a resource consent to lease any of those car parks, but now that can be done if it's beyond the requirement for the activity, and a lot of those car parking on-site requirements are much lower than the number of car parks they actually have on those sites.
Councillor O'Malley.
Thanks very much for the report, and I'm quite excited about seeing what's coming through here. I am going to do a car parking question too, but it's a little bit different, and that is that in the Cashel Street Mall in Christchurch, when they pedestrianised Cashel Street, which is a long time ago now, it was 100 metres from the Litchfield Street car park, which was a large multi-storey car park that fed in off the one-way system. So it allowed people to get into that area, then park their car in a vertical manner, and then the street itself did not require any more parking at that point and was completely pedestrianised. And now I will kind of follow up Councillor Wiley's thing, and I guess this is also to transport as well and the general movement of traffic. And I asked the other day whether that would be person movements or traffic movements into the city. People can't beam into the city. They have to get in here one way or another, and we don't have much control over the public transport system, which I would like to see significantly upgraded. So I think there will be a fair amount of vehicular movement, personal vehicle movement into the city from those in the periphery, which means they have to stop somewhere. I would kind of like to see what Generation Zero is proposing, that we go...
Sorry, Councillor, can we have a question, please?
Yeah, I'm getting to the question is, can we take into account in the design, when all these design factors are taken into account, the idea that we could take those car parks out of that street, potentially, but we would obviously, I assume, and this is the point of the background, you would acknowledge that we would probably have to deal with some other infrastructure spend that would have to go with that. Would that be correct in saying that?
It does seem that way to me, based on what I know.
And I'd like to thank you for your interactions with the Disabled People's Assembly. When we're looking at the curb issues, you were showing the other day the effect of those small wheels in the front of the things and their in relationship to the edge of the curb.
Yeah.
So will that be taken into account when we're doing the design?
Absolutely. So I'll follow up on that conversation this Friday with the Disabilities Issues Advisory Group, and I'll follow up with our contract engineer to make sure that we address that issue and try to come up with the best design solution. I know that there was an issue raised that the current standards don't always actually allow for that universal access of space. So we probably need to look at something slightly above some of those standards. So I'm happy to prioritise that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Further questions? Appearing to be none. Thank you. I will therefore, let's go to the recommendations on page 31. I'll move that both of them, but with the addition of the words in A, subject to final council approval. So that will just involve the final drawings coming back for discussion at the appropriate forum. Seconded by Councillor Wilson. I think we've had a pretty extensive run around the houses, so I'm not going to speak to the motion. I may need to write a reply, but other speakers, please.
Yes, please.
Go for it.
I would just like to, apart from complimenting the well-designed concept, I would like to just generally highlight the effect of colour, overall colour. I'm in a part of the world currently where there are a number of beautiful cities, and they have all been quite careful to avoid grey. And I have some information here from Dr. Max Lucia, who was a Swiss psychotherapist who did a lot of research into colour. And there are certain psychological associations with colour, and I'd just like to highlight two of them. One of them is that brown apparently associates psychologically with the senses, bodily senses, yellow with activity and aspiration, whereas grey associates with non-involvement and concealment. It also associates with the coming of night and a general reduction in activity. So if, when we're considering just these broad colour palettes, I would very much like to confirm that the current colour of the octagon tiles, for instance, is a warm colour, and that it would be nice to avoid the concrete jungle look of grey. Other than that, I'm very happy to vote for the recommended option 1 and compliment Dr. Phillip on what I consider to be a well designed and coherent concept that takes everybody into account, including some parking. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor, for your insights. It will be very helpful for you when you have a moment, not at the moment, obviously, given that it's probably dark, for you to walk around with your camera and send us photos of nice treatments that you find interesting. It's a pity you couldn't see us here because your comments might have been constrained by the clothing that people are wearing at the meeting and what the implications of that might be. Councillor Gary.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say that I think of this as being a really exciting development and stage towards increasing the livability of our city. I thank you for your consideration of people with disabilities. I think that's really important to inclusiveness in our city. And I had a third point and it's gone. I'll leave it at that, thank you. Oh, I know, final thing was, let's be bold. We need to be bold going forward, and I appreciate that we've made a start towards that. Thanks.
Councillor Wilson.
Only in response and agreement with Councillor Vandervis about the colours. The one colour he didn't mention, and I hope it's not off the palette to a certain extent, is green. And that's grass, and I think the need for some green in this part of Dunedin especially would be ideal, and if it can be incorporated in anything other than just the trees that are very nice in there, it'd be great as well. So it's challenging. Just add that in.
Further speakers? Councillor Hawkins.
Yeah, thank you. Excuse me, just briefly. This is really exciting in terms of the further development of this work, but it always makes me nervous when our urban design outcomes are compromised by what staff feel like they could, quote, get through, unquote. Being bold, as has been suggested by other councillors, is something that I would endorse, and it would be good to have those options in front of us as to decisions made around whether it's paving treatments or car parking or all of those sorts of things. I don't think it's fair to put staff in a position where they feel like they have to make those compromised decisions because they are ultimately political ones. As has been mentioned already this afternoon, this is probably something we're not going to revisit for another 25 or 30 years, so best to try and get the best outcome we can now rather than compromise which has a tendency towards satisfying nobody. And I look forward to seeing the next iteration of these after consultation with the various stakeholders around accessibility and other issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
I just want to say it's very exciting to be going into this as well, and I do concur with Councillor Wilson about the green down there. I think the other component of this is there's already a transition from Vogel Street to Bond Street in terms of design and maybe more contemporary where we're going. And I hope this speaks to informing us when we come to the Centre City plan as to what we can do with those areas.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for that. And right of reply, I'd echo that view because I think it's really important, irrespective of the views about the constraints that you feel are operating under, which are very much real in many areas. I think it's important that our community gets to see the potential that a lot of the city has. And I think the feedback that I've already seen in social media and elsewhere to the drawing of the laneway that Councillor van der Vis referred to, that's been extraordinarily positive. And I think a lot of people who've seen this sort of thing elsewhere know that we can do our own version of it, and it is just amazing what could happen in that area. And I'm sure this is one of the yet another step in that direction. Equally, I think it's a great way of asking people to look at and think about and experience and see how these environments work as we do get on with a lot of discussions I think that will be had about the Central City Plan. I guess as a microcosm of that discussion, you can see the interest and the work that's already gone into this relatively confined area. Just imagine how many views are going to be presented as we start talking about much more of the central city and how we manage traffic and transport and so on. The final comment I'd make is that I'm glad it was acknowledged by the staff because the request has been made several times for investigation of real-time parking availability information in the central city and wayfinding of the sort that is common elsewhere, so that I've often, in fact, I've always been of the view that there isn't actually a shortage of parking per se. There's a shortage of free parking and there's a shortage of being able to find parking, especially for non-Dunedin people. And I think we do need to put in place some real-time information to help drivers with that so that they can get closer to where they will find much more attractive spaces. So I'll put this. I think we'll better have a division just to check that everyone knows they're on the record. So.
Councillor Gary.
Yes.
Councillor Hall. Yes. Councillor Hawkins.
Aye.
Councillor Lefiso.
Aye.
Councillor Lord.
Aye.
Councillor O'Malley.
Aye.
Councillor Steedman.
Aye.
Councillor van der Vis.
Lee.
Aye.
Councillor Wiley.
Aye.
Councillor Wilson.
Aye.
Councillor Benson Pope.
Aye. And I say to declare that that's carried unanimously. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's the end of that item. Can we go now to the Part A reports, item 5, please? Thank you for such an extensive interrogation, Dr. Phillip.
Thank you for accommodating the time change as well.
Thank you very much.
Have a productive evening. All right, so we have the staff to respond to Mr. Blair and Ms. McGill. And sorry, welcome, Paul. Do you want to make any introductory comments in terms of the reporting, Mr. Blair?
No, Mr. Chair, but we're happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Does anyone have a question anywhere about any particular part of the report? There is nothing? It is very good. All right, well, we won't prolong things unnecessarily. I'll move that the report be noted, seconded by Councillor Steadman. Any discussion? Those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no, that's agreed. I'm sorry, but I hope you found the earlier part of the meeting informative and entertaining. And that takes us to the final item, item 6. The submission on the DCC, submission on the DOC draft threatened species strategy. Thank you very much. Welcome. Now, Ms. Yonu, would you like to make any comment? Any questions anywhere? Councillor van der Bus.
Yes, I note that in item 10 that the recognition of the problem of myrtle rust is recognised, but I seem to have missed any recognition of Kauri dieback. Is Kauri dieback something we should also have in this submission?
Well, I wouldn't have thought so because of our location, but I'll ask staff if Mr. Sugashid, do you want to make any response?
No, that's the exact reason. Yes.
It's a location issue. Tell.
In terms of the Kauri dieback disease, the omission is because that natural distribution of Kauri is limited to the north of 38 degrees south latitude, so the Dunedin is located far outside the natural distribution of the species. That's why it's omitted. Thank you.
Councillor O'Malley.
I just want to highlight that I have a very unnatural distribution of a beautiful Kauri tree in our garden, and I know I'm not the only one. I know someone who has 3 Kauris, one of them about 10 metres high. So it would be, I think, something which we don't want to ignore.
Well, you and Pete Hodgson are exceptions, obviously. He has one as well at Sawyers Bay.
That becomes a political choice whether to include that in the submission at that point.
Thank you. Councillor O'Malley.
I would just follow up on Councillor van der Bus' question and say, well, if the Kauri in the northern, who are in the northern distribution area are in fact wiped out because of this disease, it will be the southern Kauri who are in people's gardens that will in fact be the last remainder of the species. So you want to be careful when you make a decision, and so I'm wondering, in fact, considering it from that perspective, would we consider it to be back in there?
I don't think we can add anything at this point.
Okay, well, anyway, we can put it in there.
That's a retrospective approval. All right, further questions?
No, to clarify, we can change the submission, as I understand it, if you wish to add things to the submission, but we cannot add anything in terms of a staff view on that perspective.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Well, do you want to make, ask staff to make a reference to Kauri dieback disease so that the point you raise is covered?
I think if Councillor van der Bus wants to put in, but I mean, I think the reality is just raising it now to our, because I mean, I think that the issue with Kauri dieback disease is not going to happen overnight in this area, so.
Okay, well, I've got someone happy to move the recommendation. Councillor Stones, seconded by Councillor Lord. Further discussion? The approval, those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against, no. That's agreed, and that takes us to any items that people wish to bring to the attention of the Chair for consideration or action. There being none, I declare the meeting closed. Have a safe evening.